Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Was this the day when Max Verstappen's title ambitions officially came to a close? He had a miracle from P17 on the grid last year. He will need something very similar tomorrow if he wants any chance of stopping the McLarens this year, and especially the McLaren of championship leader Lando Norris. An unbelievably good weekend for Lando so far, especially based on the results of the sprint earlier in the day, and where Piastri's current championship ambitions have gone to tatters in recent rounds. So much to get into. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Verstappen's furious about what they did with his car today. We'll get into what that might be here in a second, because Yuki Tsunoda started the sprint race today way down the order with a major change. They decided, you know what, in terms of experimentation, we will totally change the setup for Yuki going into the sprint. That is what they did. Did Yuki have a great time in the sprint? Not really. Did he seem especially happy with the changes they made to the car? Not really. But apparently they set the suspension up slightly softer, they raised the ride height slightly higher, basically as an experiment, but they felt that it actually kind of worked. And based on that reaction from Yuki's car, apparently, although I'm not sure Yuki was really happy about it, to be honest, they decided to run the same thing for Max when it came later to qualifying, and, well, we'll see how that went in a few minutes' time. We've got to, however, talk about the sprint, because this was critical for the championship again. It looked for some time that Piastri was going to get past Antonelli on the first few laps, maybe mix it up with Lando. Piastri was only a couple of tenths of Oscar or of Lando yesterday, and it looked like, okay, if we come second or third in the sprint, at least he is getting back into the mix, right, in terms of his championship ambitions. That is not how things went 5 or 6 laps later. We've got to start here as well. So this was Ollie Bearman getting very racy with Liam Lawson. So Lawson is on his inside here. Bearman pushes him basically onto the grass, which was, yeah, aggressive defense, I would say, at the very least. Lawson then comes alongside, but on the entry to the corner, Lawson is forced to brake early because he's on the inside line. And look, the racing guidelines effectively say if you want to be entitled to space, you've got to be at least alongside on the entry, the middle of the corner. Now, this corner turn 4, it's a very long entry. So Bearman, all he needs to be, Bearman, is ahead by half a car length at this moment, and Lawson is not entitled to any space. And that is what he is. But Lawson does eventually come down the inside about here. They make contact, and actually a couple of seconds later after the contact, because Lawson then washes wide, you know, Bearman did leave space on the inside. Not much, but he did attempt to leave space for Lawson. Then he got tagged and spun around. So, look, the first incident was Bearman being very aggressive in his defense. The second incident was certainly more on Lawson, I thought. They could maybe have said, we'll just let it go, call it a racing incident, but instead, they gave both drivers penalties. So Bearman got a 5-second penalty for driving in a dangerous manner. He got 1 more penalty point. He got a couple reduced over the last couple of rounds, so he's now up to 9 again, but he's got a long way to go until those expire, so he's still got to be a little bit careful, Bearman. And then Lawson got a 5-second penalty and another point himself for, didn't affect the race because it was penalties applied to their actual race finishes, which weren't very high, but he got a penalty for the turn 4 collision. So, an absolute mess. Look, Bearman, mostly Lawson, I think, but, you know, these guys continue to get into some dramas most weekends. But let's talk about lap 6. So, the rain had come down earlier in the day. Wasn't a massive effect on the race. We thought that it might be a real problem today, but it turned out that a massive storm cloud was just slightly north of Sao Paulo rather than to the south. If it was to the south, we would have had a very different day today. We did, however, have some rain early in the day. That left these as the curbs on turn 3. We can see they're not like, you know, the curbs you might get in Austria and some other circuits. You can see the puddles within the curbs. And as we can see in this picture, on about lap 6, Lando started on the mediums. He's now getting away a little bit. Antonelli started on the soft tyres, is trying to put a little bit of pressure on. coming through the center S's, Lando kicks up a little bit of water from that curbing. Now, Antonelli said he put some water on the track, which of course he did, but it wasn't about that. People were saying, oh, he threw like some banana peel down to trip up Piastri. Like, first of all, that was never his intention. And secondly, that's not what happened anyway, because the water on the track was not the reason why 3 individuals spun out within about 10 seconds of this. It could have been more. Of course, Antonelli got to see the fact that Norris had just gone over the curb there, thrown up some water, and probably thought, that could be a little bit risky. So Antonelli avoided it, but Piastri went straight in. Now, I've also got to say, Max did the same thing, which is actually kind of remarkable here. Now, Max is on the soft tyre, a bit more grip, of course, so it definitely helps his case. But as we see, Max does exactly what the other guys do, right? He gets well onto the curb, and look at this massive oversteer moment, right? He has a massive save that he has to make mid-corner. This is the amount of steering lock he has to have on. And if you watch Piastri's on board, it was kind of a slow and clumsy loss of control. You know, I've got to say, if Max was in charge of that McLaren today, the number 81, I think he probably saves it. But yeah, Oscar didn't save it. Now, to be fair, the drivers should know that if you take any curb here, if you take any white line, you are running a risk. And there's probably an expectation for Max here that, you know, I could lose the rear end here, so I'm just going to be a little bit careful. He did lose the rear end, he saves it, stays alive. The remarkable thing about this picture is that as we roll it forward a couple of seconds, you see Oscar Piastri right there in the wall, because a ton of drivers did this on the very same lap. They felt like, okay, it's dry enough now, I can take a little bit of curb. And a lot of them nearly came to a similar fate. But Piastri was worst affected by this, right? As you can see, he takes too much curb. Look, was it slightly to do with Lando kicking up water in front? Maybe yes, because it meant that also Oscar's tyres on the right weren't quite as grippy as they could have been. But, you know, the reality was this was an overcommitment. It was taking a little bit too much risk. And that's what Piastri did, and obviously he's got a bit of dirty air as well from the car in front, but you can see how much curb he's taking here, and that's a big risk. Hulkenberg takes a similar amount, Colapinto takes a similar amount, and all of them are spinning out of the Grand Prix or out of the sprint race. But, you know, that's what I'm saying. Max did the same thing, but he got away with it because he's got that level of car control. That was not the case for these 3 guys. They all end up in the barriers at the same time. A remarkable scene. And, I mean, they nearly crashed into one another. When I first saw this, I thought, wow, how has Piastri and Colapinto crashed into each other? Like, is he getting lapped or something? But, yeah, no, they all did this of their own volition. So, absolutely remarkable incident, and huge in the context of the championship, right? Because it was looking pretty good for Oscar. He'd done okay in qualifying yesterday. Okay, he was 2 tenths down on Lando, but it wasn't 6 tenths. It was getting better, felt more comfortable in the car. McLaren was saying some positive things about Piastri, you know, finding his feet again and all this. And after the first few laps, it felt like Antonelli was the one under pressure from Oscar, and that he was maybe going to get seconds. And then probably they would stay that way to the end of the race, but then it would be, you know, 2-point championship deficit, no big deal. But Oscar in the wall, again, I mean, look at this recent performance. Baku, he gets a DNF, and, you know, I said it in the little pre-show we did earlier, but, you know, DNF almost feels quite generous for the absolute disaster class that was Baku. Then P4 in Singapore, DNF'd in the sprint rate, that was his own fault in Austin, P5 in the main race, P5 in Mexico, which, you know, was a decent comeback, but hurt by a bad qualifying, and then DNF'd in the sprint race again. So he's not at a podium in 3 months, or 2 months at least, actually, Oscar Piastri. That's not what you want as a championship challenger. I also think that Oscar's mentality is going to be stretched after today more than we have seen before. Because I think, especially after Baku, my perception was that Oscar's body language was still relatively confident. He was like, okay, yeah, it was a bad weekend, it was an off weekend, but, you know, still feeling pretty good. I think today, just watching this interview, like, you know, when he crashed, he put his head in his hands. You can see his reaction here to the cameras is, you know, he's clearly very disappointed in himself. He's clearly feeling the pressure. Whether the pressure contributed to the crash, to the over, you know, commitment or whatever, that's a slightly different question. But I think mentally, this especially is going to be challenging to come back from, because today is in many respects the day where Max's title bid looks to have come to a close. So if there was ever a day that he really needed to lock in, it would have been today. I mean, you can see by his reaction here, obviously his body language isn't going to be positive after this, but it really does feel like watching some of his reaction that like, yeah, basically he just says, bad mistake, silly mistake, it is what it is. He had, of course, an opportunity a couple of hours later to get revenge on that in main qualifying. That's not how things transpired. Now, quick comment on the restart here, because they restarted the race as a rolling start, which I thought was quite controversial because they red flagged it, they had to fix the barriers, okay, fair enough. Therefore, they got to use different tyres. Norris then went on to the softs because they felt like they could get that to the end without using another pair of mediums that they might want to save for tomorrow, which is understandable. I think it's probably a good decision there. Mercedes went on to the mediums, so they were probably going to be a threat to Max or to Lando towards the end. You see Max in the background here, who had a nice little battle with Fernando Alonso and still scored some solid points, but at the end of the day, it wasn't quite going to be enough. But given they did a standing start 30 minutes earlier when it was actually wetter, then what's the logic behind a rolling start here? The logic probably is they'd had a few collisions, they didn't want any more crashes, and, crack on with it, lads. But, there are people that say, oh, well, Lando was in the lead, British bias, right? So, as ever, intrigued to your thoughts on that. At the end of the race, because nothing else really happens, we did get a monster crash. You can see here that Bortoletto's steering wheel is totally out of its bay in an absolutely huge incident. I mean, this was the main angle here. So just to kind of go through what happened, really, the first frame of this actually doesn't quite do it justice. This is the frame that is worth looking at. So Bortoletto, he's got DRS, he's got an opportunity to get past Albon in front of the home crowd, and, well, his DRS is still open at this moment. Now, this isn't like a mechanical failure or something. He's got his foot down at this point. As soon as he lifts his foot off the throttle, or certainly once he touches the brake, that will close. But he goes to the inside to try and make the dive bomb move just before he hits the brakes, or he turns off DRS manually, which he could have done. He could have turned it off manually like Doohan could have done back in Japan earlier this year. But he elected not to do so, and that probably would have been fine if it had been dry. But because it was wet, he turns the wheel to the inside. DRS is still open. He doesn't quite have the downforce at the rear. He loses the rear, and he's into the barriers at absolutely massive speed. You can see here that as soon as he tries to go for this move, DRS closes a fraction of a second later. But at this point, he's already lost the rear of the car at 200 miles an hour. He's into this wall at a 37G impact, and then, based on the camber of the track, he then slides across the track with a 57G impact into the... I mean, look at that shot. That is incredible. I mean, we've seen big incidents here before. I think Albon himself had a big incident here last year. But, oh my God, this was a crash. And incredible that Bortoletto just got out of the car and walked away, because this was a huge one right in front of the grandstand. So very glad he's okay. It could have been really bad for... I mean, you can see Albon here. Imagine a world where he takes out Albon as well. That could have been really scary. And it obviously was scary, but yeah, so glad that Bortoletto could walk away from that one. There was no chance for him to qualify, but, presumably his car will be fixed in time for tomorrow. They'll probably give him an exemption to race anyway tomorrow because of his times earlier in the weekends. But Norris wins the sprint from Antonelli, from Russell, Max, Leclerc, Alonso, Hamilton. Hamilton had a really good start, got up to 8th, then benefited, as we know, from Oscar Piastri's crash. Gasly gets a point for Alpine in 8th, which was a good result for him. And the championship, therefore, looks like this. Norris now 9 points ahead of Oscar Piastri. How the turns have tabled over the last few rounds. Verstappen at 326, but even then it still wasn't looking great for him. But what we did know going into qualifying later was that Red Bull were going to make major wholesale changes to their car. But were those changes going to be for the better or for the worse? Because apparently in qualifying, they didn't run the Mexico floor upgrades that didn't really work in Mexico. They ran back to the Austin car, where things were all rather good. But that simply didn't work. So it's fascinating to think about the Red Bull. For a few races, it looked like it was going to be right there. It was only a few days ago, I feel like, where I mentioned that Max is likely the qualifying favourite everywhere we go. Clearly, that is no longer the case. And on certain tracks, it's still a massive struggle to get the RB21 in a properly balanced window. So even though they regressed some of the upgrades, it simply didn't work. Qualifying eventually gets underway. Ferrari, they had no straight line speed in the sprint, so they went for a lower downforce setup, which seemed to work to some degree, but not really. Then we get the first laps come through. So Oscar Piastri, very first lap, massive lockup, right? So it's not a great start for Piastri's qualifying when his very first attempt he has a huge lockup and has a terrible lap. Then Lando comes over the line, and it's only 1.4 tenths up on Lawson, but it was purple, purple, purple. Again, extremely impressive. I think Lando will take a lot of confidence in today because, again, this qualifying session was not exactly perfect, certainly when we get to Q3, but it was one of the results that Lando should, I think, take a lot of confidence from. All of a sudden, though, at the top of the scoreboards here, we see the key contenders. Behrman, Lawson, among others, were like some actual genuinely important names today. And Ollie Behrman did a 109.8 in the first part of qualifying, which was extremely competitive even when we get to Q3, as we'll see in a couple of seconds. But this was the important moment. So Tsunoda was down in P19. Verstappen was down in P16, and Max had a terrible middle sector though. He had a big snap and it cost him 4 tenths. So it was like, okay, Max is, he lost 4 or 5 tenths in that corner. He'd probably be 3-4 tenths off the pace. It's not great, but at least it's not disaster territory. But it turns out it was disaster territory because we fast forward a couple of minutes. They're on their final flying laps. Russell goes 4th at this moment. Norris has just pipped Behrman up top. And Verstappen is on the radio saying, lads, the ride is a bit better, but now it's sliding in turn 1. I've got no grip. I've got to drive very much within the car to make sure it doesn't just crash out on me. I've got 0 grip, 0, absolutely brilliant. And I don't know, like you can see in this image, I think, can't you? That car looks like it's riding quite high. The ride height looks very high to me, actually, compared to where Red Bull would probably usually be. And I'm a little confused because if they did raise the ride height of the car after the sprint race going into qualifying, why, right? Like, surely there was a recognition that they were simply going to lose themselves performance doing that. I don't know what they were thinking exactly, but that car looks like it's riding pretty high to me. Max had no downforce, he had no grip, and he crosses the line. Tsunoda goes P18, but Max is yellow, sector 1, and at the end of the lap, Max is yellow, green, yellow, 600ths down. I don't think he got the time to go in for a new set of tyres, which also wasn't ideal, but at the end of the day, it didn't massively matter. I think that's near enough, at least being with Red Bull, the first time in Max's career he's been out in Q1 on pace without any sort of other dramas. So, what a way for it to go, right? Last year we saw him end up P17, fought his way back through the field in phenomenal fashion in the rain. It doesn't look like it's going to rain tomorrow as it stands. There might be a little bit, but it's probably not going to be like it was last year with all the dramas that ensued as a result of that. So Max making something similar happen this year feels incredibly implausible. And for him to be out in Q1, both Red Bulls out in Q1, the only team that are both of their cars out in Q1, and still nearly a tenth of even getting through to Q2 anyway. So truly remarkable what they managed to do today. Even Verstappen could not save that car today, and understandably, there was immediate frustration. This was Jos Verstappen, the camera went straight to him, and he was storming out of the garage. He was not a happy man. This is another shot of it here with Jos and Max below. So, look, of course, the immediate intention for Max is firstly to figure out what the hell went wrong with their car. Why? Because they were giving it a big game, weren't they, right? Helmut Marko said, oh, well, we've got something else up our sleeve. We've got a big upgrade on the way, right? Like, Max is going to give it a good go for the championship. You've got Laura McKee saying, well, glad we invested in this car. We've understood the car now. We know what went wrong. Now we've got a great car to finish the season. All of a sudden, it's not looking so clear, and the technical team at Red Bull are once again under some serious pressure. Verstappen, Ocon, Colapinto, Tsunoda, Bortoleto, they were out in Q1. Bortoleto, of course, never quite got the chance. Behrman, just quickly, by the way, he was 3rd and Ocon was 17th. So just wanted to point that out yet again. But let's talk about Q2. This was Max not looking especially happy. There is a question on whether they should just take an engine, like take a new engine, change the whole setup, start from the pit lane. and just see what happens. Because if you're starting P16 anyway, you might think that you might as well just get a brand new spicy engine for the rest of the season. Maybe it'll give them a chance. It's probably not the biggest problem that they currently have to solve. And as Max says, pretty unexpected, no grip. We made quite a few changes. Max said, well, yeah, things were very much worse. No feeling in the car. So not a happy man. Q2 gets underway and Behrman does a 109.7. So, like, the Haas was looking really compliant in his hands. I thought it was very impressive. Again, he got to Q3 and probably overdrove it a little bit, I would say. But, because you always want to improve. I mean, a 109.7 would have been good enough for second place on the grid, near enough, wouldn't it? We'll see the results of that in a second. So Q2 gets underway. The big drama, I guess, here really was Hamilton out. Again, a big story, but not as big, of course, as the Verstappen incident, given that he was really right there in the championship fight. But yeah, interesting, very, very competitive, as it often is around Brazil. But Norris this time was actually outdone by Piastri. That was notable, right? You thought, okay, maybe Oscar's back here, right? Got a 10th on Oscar, got a 10th on Lando during the course of that lap. This was Charles Leclerc with a big snap coming out of turn 4, so he would have to go again. Everyone did go again. Norris then went P1, only a 10th and a half, and that was a 109.6 for Norris, which is not far off what he did in Q3. Hamilton then had a decent start to the lap, but lost a little bit of time in the middle sector in a very competitive qualifying session. While Leclerc was through, Hamilton was a couple of tenths off that, and he was out in Q2. So another big scalp taken. Again, he was not happy with the rear of the car for the majority of the session, was struggling with it quite a lot, lost the rear in the final corner pretty much, and that cost him a place in Q3. So again, just a real stinker for Ferrari. Leclerc did manage to put together something that even surprised him. Leclerc afterwards was like, I don't really know what's up with our car, but sometimes on one run it feels great and other times it feels terrible. But Lando gets in again. The consistency of Lando right now to top all of these sessions is quite impressive, right? Like, he might not be topping them by massive amounts, but Lando's always been there lately. But Q3 gets underway and Lando has a big lock-up into turn 1. So this was, to me, a very important moment, right? Because in Mexico, Lando just nailed it. His first run was good but not great. His second run was fantastic, good enough for pole. Sprint qualifying yesterday, both of his laps were good enough for pole. Today, big lock-up turn 1 on his first attempt. Tricky conditions, it wasn't clear that Q3 was faster than Q2. The track was rubbering in, but it was windy. It was, not easy out there for the drivers. So, but Lando, he doesn't get his banker in as he should have done. He still pushes, and he still goes purple actually, but he was 6.5 tenths off the pace after losing basically a second in the first corner. And then Piastri did enough to go P1 himself. So he was P1 by 2 thousandths over Leclerc. Then Behrman was less than a tenth back on that. Gasly, he deserves a lot of credit getting into Q3. And to be honest, the entire Q3 lineup was remarkable. Gasly was in there. Both of the Racing Bulls, on a day where Red Bull were atrocious, is really a statement. Hulkenberg, and then of course both in a Mercedes. So Antonelli was already purple sector 1. Again, great day for Antonelli. Like, he was consistently faster than Russell all weekend so far. And that to me was extremely impressive around such a driver's track as Brazil is considered to be. Not massively so, but yeah, Antonelli's really been on it this weekend and looked like the most likely challenger for pole outside of Lando Norris. But Lando was 10th at this point, right? Clearly 10th. And that put the pressure seriously on Lando to deliver on his second lap. This is where we've seen Lando before bottle it, right? Make a couple of mistakes, come 7th or something. But it felt like this time was a little bit different. His sector 1 was solid. His sector 2 was mighty. And it was good enough in the end, quite comfortably, really, to stick it on pole. So Leclerc did a great lap to his credit as well. But Lando comes over the line with a 109.5, 3 tenths up on Leclerc. And eventually what would be near enough 4 tenths up on Piastri. Piastri was just, the middle sector just didn't look so comfortable with the car, right? Whereas Lando was quite flowy. Piastri was trying to wrestle the car a little bit. And often that makes you slower. Feels like Norris has really found a groove with this car at the moment. But even then, a couple of tenths off Lando wasn't the end of the world for Piastri. The problem is, that there were a couple of Mercedes coming for him as well. Russell gave the mediums a go, which was interesting. Not sure I really liked that idea. He did go faster, to be fair, on the mediums than the softs, so maybe it was worth a go. Both of the Racing Bulls again did a pretty good job, but Antonelli comes over the line, 2/10 down on Norris. That was good enough though for second on the grid. Piastri down to fourth, then Hadjar, Russell, Lawson, Behrman, Gasly and Hulkenberg. All of those guys split by half a second. Massively competitive qualifying session. But again, the keynote really is towards the championship. And very notably, in terms of Lando being on pole, Piastri being P4, but having two drivers from another team between them, right? And Max isn't in the picture. So as far as Lando's concerned, today couldn't have been much better, right? He got pole again. He won the sprint, he increased his championship lead to 9 points. Piastri crashed out, clearly suffering with some confidence issues at the moment, I would argue. Max is out of the picture tomorrow. Look, this championship is far from over yet. People that are crowning Norris the world champion, I think, are certainly on the verge of speaking too soon, but there's only one way that this is presently going. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Tomorrow will be critical. As I said at the start of the video, if Max doesn't pull off a miracle tomorrow, his championship hopes are probably over. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.